Hello and welcome to this quick start chapter in Introduction to ZBrush 4R8. This is typically how I like to start any lesson in ZBrush. Instead of dropping in and looking at individual tools and techniques in a vacuum, I find the best way to teach this program is to start creating something right out of the gate. So in this quick start, we're going to take a polysphere and basically treat it like a ball of digital clay. And we're going to sculpt a creature head from that sphere. This is going to give us an opportunity to see how to navigate, how to use Dynamesh and subdivision levels, how to use the various brushes and sculpt with them, as well as how to use things like subtools. This lets us see the most commonly used tools in ZBrush in action, so you understand them in context. You understand why you use them by using them. So let's go ahead and get started. When you first open ZBrush, you'll see something like this. You'll have the lightbox open, and it's most likely going to be open to the Projects menu. What we're going to do is we're going to change the Tool section right here under Lightbox, and there you'll find the polysphere.ztl. That's my favorite Z tool to use as a base to sculpt on. I do lots of sketches like we're going to do today on a polysphere. So you just double click that, and you'll see that it becomes your active Z tool here. We'll close out of the Lightbox menu, and now I'm just going to click and drag to draw that sphere on the canvas. Now take note that your mouse is a white circle right now. What that means is that you're not in edit mode. So if I were to keep stroking on the canvas, I would just draw more spheres. I would never be able to navigate or sculpt on it. To be able to sculpt on the tool that I just drew on the canvas, I need to come up here and press the edit button. And you'll notice from the tooltip there, the hotkey is the letter T. Anytime there's a hotkey in ZBrush, if you hover over that button or that menu option, it will tell you what the hotkey is. So I'm going to press the T key, and you'll notice that my cursor turns red, and now my floor plane appears. The floor plane is just this button right here on the side of the screen that turns it on and off. If you do not have a floor plane on your screen, click this button and it will appear. That just helps me get oriented as to where the front, sides, and back of my sphere are as I'm working. So the next thing we want to do is we want to turn on X symmetry, because we're able to sculpt right now on the sphere, but we want to sculpt on both sides. So I'm going to press the X key, and now you see I've got two dots on either side of the figure, or the sphere. That just allows me to sculpt with symmetry turned on. Now what I want to do is I want to understand how to navigate, so we can look straight down the Z-axis at the sphere and be sculpting on either side of it. So to do that, I'm going to rotate. To rotate in ZBrush, it's the simplest navigation. You're just going to click somewhere off the model. You see that my cursor is already a little arrow in a circle. If I click and drag, I'm rotating. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm looking straight down this axis right here where the two spheres are, or the two dots are on the sphere. So I'm going to rotate and get close to that view, and then I'm going to press and hold the Shift key. What that does is it locks to the nearest orthographic view. So if I'm rotating towards the top view and I press Shift, it locks to the top. If I rotate down towards the front and then press Shift, it locks to the front. Now what I need to do is I need to take my cursor up off the tablet pen and then let go of Shift. Because if you do it this way, if you start rotating towards the front and press Shift, it snaps to the front. But then if you let go of Shift, it just bounces back to where it was. You need to lift up your pen and then lift off Shift. So again, rotate towards the view you want to lock to, press the Shift key, and it'll snap to that view. Lift your pen, let go of Shift. So that's how you lock to an orthographic view. And that's an extremely useful thing to get a hold of. And navigation in ZBrush, if you've never used the program before, it might be a little bit tricky at first, but you will get it within a day. Just work through it and keep trying, and you will internalize those muscle memory movements, and you'll be able to navigate quickly like anyone else. So we understand how to rotate, and we understand how to snap to a view now. Let's say that our model is somewhere off camera like this and we can't find it. Or let's say that we're zoomed in really close and we can't get away from it. What we need to do then is press the F key for focus, and that'll refocus the model on screen. Now we want to know how to zoom. Zooming is based around the Alt key as well. So if I press Alt and then click and drag on the background, I'm going to move the object around. If I let go of the Alt key and just keep moving my cursor up and down, I'll zoom in and out. So to repeat that, press the Alt key, press and drag on your tablet, or click and drag with your mouse, and you'll move the object around. If you let go of Alt after doing that, you'll zoom. So it's Alt, touch down, let go of Alt, drag. Now there is a button over here for Zoom 3D. You can use that when you're starting out, but I don't really recommend using these buttons for navigation. You're much better off if you just learn the hotkeys and just internalize them and just get fast at it on your own, because this will take a bit of time if you come over here and try and use these. So again, Alt, touch down with tablet pen, let go of Alt, and then drag up and down with your tablet pen. So now we know how to zoom, we know how to tumble, and we know how to rotate. So we're looking straight down the z-axis of our model now, and we can start sculpting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my brush selection. Your default brush when you start ZBrush is the standard brush right here. And this is kind of your generic brush. It sort of adds and subtracts depending on whether or not you're holding the Alt key down. And it just allows you to add material or subtract. It's not very special. There's nothing particularly unique about it. It's just sort of a workhorse generic brush. We want to start by using the Move brush so we can start shaping the sphere into sort of a head form. So I'm going to press the B key for the brush menu. Now that opens up my brush menu. That's the exact same as coming up here and pressing the brush palette button right there. That opens up my brush menu, or my brush palette. From the brush palette, I want to select the Move brush. So I'm going to press B for brush. Now instead of getting overwhelmed by all of these icons, just press M for Move. And you'll notice that it has now limited that brush menu to just those brushes that start with the letter M. And these are alphabetically organized, so you can actually see there's the Move brush right there. And there's a little orange letter next to each one of those. That's a contextual hotkey. That's just letting you know that if you press the B key, you'll end up selecting the Move brush. So there you see the Move brush is selected. So let's take a look at that one more time. If I want to go back to the standard brush, I do B for brush, S for standard. And then you can see the standard brush is right here. The hotkey is T. So I can either press that button or press T to select the standard brush. So those hotkeys, those orange hotkeys, are totally contextual. It just depends on which letter you've pressed and where you are inside the brush menu here. So we're going to go back to B for Move. And now I want to change my brush size. You can come up here at the top of the screen and change your draw size. You can change your focal shift, which is the center circle. That's the fall off of the brush. And you can change your Z intensity here, which is the intensity of your sculpting tool. I prefer to access all these using the spacebar menu. This is how I like to access these tools. I can change my draw size, I can change my focal shift, and I can change my Z intensity. Now some people might prefer to use the S key. The S hotkey does draw size, and the I hotkey does RGB intensity, and if we mouse over this, Z intensity is U. So if we press the U hotkey, that brings up Z intensity. It's my preference to press the spacebar because I find that my thumb is already on the Alt key so I can navigate, so it's just an easy move over to press the spacebar. So we can adjust our draw size here. We're in X symmetry mode, and I'm going to start shaping the sphere into kind of an egg shape. We're just going to make a head. We'll rotate around to the side view, and let's sort of stretch back some cranial mass here. Rotate and snap to a top view, and the head from the top view often, really looks like an egg as well, so we want to give it sort of that egg shape from the top. Now if we want to smooth, press the Shift key and your brush becomes blue, and that just turns it into a smooth brush. It lets us smooth back the geometry, which is a really nice tool. Now I want to start sculpting basic form on here. My favorite brush for roughing in and sketching on a character is clay tubes. So if I press B for brush, C for clay, and you'll see the clay tubes brush is right here. It's the T hotkey. The clay tubes brush is basically based on the clay brush. As you can see, the base type listed there is clay, and it uses the square alpha, so it gives it a real noisy, loose and gestural feel. So it's a real interesting brush in that it adds material very aggressively and keeps the surface looking real loose and gestural. It really feels like a sketch. Now, as I'm working, I have a preference for a different material for sculpting. I'm going to change that material now. If I click on the material palette, I'm going to change from this red wax material to one of these materials down here, basic material 2. Here you've got 3 menus. You've got Quick Pick, which are your most recently selected materials. The matte cap materials, which are really beautiful custom materials created specifically for ZBrush that will replicate things like different types of metal, sculpey clay, skeleton bones, wet clay. These are all really nice, and they usually have some real nice translucency, but the lighting is baked into them. Whereas down here are the standard materials, and these are all basically created from a blend shading model. I'm going to use basic material 2 because it's nice and it's gray in its base. Gives us a nice highlight, midtone, and core shadow. And it also will allow us, if we go to the light menu, we can move the light around and see our object under different lighting conditions, which is an extremely important thing to be able to do when you're sculpting. So I'm just going to quickly start sketching out bone structure here. And I'm going to change back to the move brush. I'm going to go to B for brush, M for move, and then B for move brush. And I'm going to start shaping this into the bone structure that I want to see. I want to bring these cheekbones up and out. You see, we're already starting to get some interesting kind of shapes developing here. And as you're working, kind of look for happy accidents. Look for interesting shapes developing in what you're sculpting, and then you can kind of run with those. You can get some really neat, creative ideas just from accidents in the surface. And don't forget to move around your object as you're working. Don't ever just stay in one view and sculpt, 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 because then you'll rotate your model and everything will look terrible because you haven't actually worked on anything but that front view. So I want to bring some more of that cranial mass back here. I'm going to switch back to my clay tubes brush. That's B for brush, C for clay, and then T for clay tubes. And I'll use that brush to sort of build up that skull mass back here. I want to build up that cheekbone. I'm going to build up the jaw here. And at this stage, I don't really need the floor plane anymore, so I'm going to turn that off. Building up this masseter muscle here, which would connect to the cheekbone. Just gives it a nice sense of a strong jaw. Building up the angle of the mandible, which is the angle of the jawbone there. Filling in the muscles underneath the jaw. We're going to build a neck too soon, but right now we're just sculpting. We're just sketching. I don't want to get too bogged down in any one particular detail. I just want to enjoy exploring shapes and seeing what we can come up with. I like this sort of pointy head thing. I'm going to build up the temporalis muscle right here, which will fill in that area. So what I just did there is I painted a mask. Now masking allows you to protect one area from sculpting from the other. So if I start sculpting here, you see that masked area doesn't get affected. The way I created that mask was to hold down the control key, and you'll notice that my cursor turns yellow. With my yellow cursor now, I can come in here and I can paint this gray area. That's my mask. Now, if I want to invert that mask, I control-click on the background. That's control-click, and that inverts the mask, so now this area is where I can sculpt. And the rest of the head is protected. If you want to feather the edge of the mask and soften it, control-click on the mask and it'll blur the edge. If I want to sharpen my mask, control-alt-click and it will sharpen. Masks are one of the most important things that you need to learn in ZBrush. If you can take that on today in this quick start lesson and really think about using masking as you're sculpting, you will get so much better, so much faster, because masks are what allow you to create hard forms like cheekbones butting up against soft forms like the eyelids and the eyeball area. That you have to be able to isolate one area from another to create different sort of representations of that surface. So you'll see that as we sculpt and as we go on. I'm just lightly stroking in the direction of the muscles here, and again just looking for happy accidents, looking for neat little shapes that are forming. I want to actually move out this upper brow, or the brow line and the nose in the side view. So I'm going to go to B for brush, M for move, B for the move brush. I'm going to turn up my draw size and I'm going to start pulling this out. I just want to give it a little bit more form and presence here in its silhouette. We'll pull that brow forward, pull that bone structure forward, and let's actually pull this bit out here. On a human skull, that would be the zygomatic arch. Or the zygomatic process, sorry, and this is zygomatic arch down here. So we just want to get that extended out. There we go, that adds some interesting form there. And let's go ahead and widen this nasal area here. I like this sort of eye structure that's happening here. Let's bring that eye socket back. And I'm going to smooth out what's inside there just by pressing the Shift key, smoothing that out. There we go. Now, at this stage, it's a good time to start thinking about saving your work. You should always save your work and save often, and save in iterations. Don't save with the same file over and over again, because if your file corrupts, then you lose all of your work. So you want to save Alien 01, Alien 02, Alien 03. Make sure that you save version after version. That's a really important tip to keep in mind. So to save, there's a couple ways you can save in ZBrush. If you see under the Tool menu, I've got Save As. If I go to Tool, Save As, I'm just going to save a Z tool. Just this object that I'm working on right here. If I press Control S, that's like going to File, Save As, and that's going to save a project. Now, a ZBrush project saves everything you currently have open. It'll save any alphas you've loaded, any textures, any other Z tools. Basically, it's like taking your entire ZBrush session and then saving it. It's very similar to saving a Maya project. We're going to save a project for this tutorial. So I'm going to press Control S, and that allows me to actually save everything that I'm working on right now. When you do this, you also have the option of turning on Undo History. What that means is I can save my entire undo history along with what I'm working on. That actually makes a very, very heavy file, so I would think carefully about doing that unless you had a good reason to do it. But as you're working, ZBrush saves your whole work history. Watch this. If I grab this dot right here and then drag it back to the beginning, I can go all the way back to a sphere. Or I can go all the way back through all my different steps to the end. Now, in a later section, we're going to see how you can make movies from this, which is why you might want to actually save it with your project file. But for our purposes in this introductory video, we're not going to save the undo history. So Control S, and we'll save our work. So once we've saved, we can go back to sculpting and thinking about some interesting shapes here. I'm going to use that Move brush again, B for brush, M for move, and then the B key, to bring that jawline down. So I'm going to mask out this upper portion of the skull, and I want to stretch this jaw down a bit just to give us some more real estate there to work with. And I want to bring the maxilla, sort of the teeth, forward. Now notice as I'm sculpting, I'm not getting really specific yet. I'm very careful to work in broad basic shapes as I'm sculpting, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. If you try and put too much detail in too soon, you lose your form. And form are basically the big shape relationships, the big basic shapes that make up your character. And those are really deceptively important. You might not think it because they're so basic. But if you think of something like Michelangelo's David, which is arguably one of the most successful statues ever created, it doesn't have a lot of detail in it. It's all pure form. It's all pure muscle and anatomy. So be thinking about this as you're working, and don't fall into that trap a lot of people fall into where they're like, oh, I've got to put lots of detail in really soon. Don't. Just think about the big shapes, because if you're thinking about those big shapes and you get all those forms working correctly, then everything you do in terms of detail later is going to look nice, because it's sitting on a nice framework. It's like building the frame of a house, or building the foundation of any important thing. It has to be really good. You'll notice that I haven't subdivided yet. Those of you that know about subdivisions, that's because I like to work at the lowest possible subdivision level for the longest time before I either Dynamesh or add a subdivision. So at this stage, let's actually talk about subdivision levels. If we go to the Tool menu and open up Geometry, you'll notice here there is a slider. This represents our subdivision levels. If I take the slider and go down to 1, you'll see the object becomes very, very simple. It's just 1,538 faces. Now if I step up this slider, every time I do, that number multiplies by 4. That's the foundation of how ZBrush sculpts detail. It takes a polygon object, most likely a low polygon object, allows you to subdivide it to add more geometry, and then sculpt details into that geometry. And as you run out of geometry, you need to add a new subdivision level to be able to sculpt more detail. That's how subdivision sculpting works. There's also another technique that we're going to be using called Dynamesh, which we'll talk about in a second. Right now, let's just look at subdivision levels. So right now I'm on subdivision level 3, and you see that I'm getting all these facets in the mouth here. If I come here and click Divide, now I've got subdivision level 4. My mesh is even denser, and I can come in here and I can sculpt even more detail. Like if I wanted to put some holes in here for the nostrils, I can do that. Just create some striations here of sort of muscle coming down from the cheekbones. I'm going to smooth back some of those shapes. Now, when I'm on my smooth brush, watch this. If I press Shift and then Smooth, it's very destructive. It erases everything. The reason is because watch here at my Z intensity. If I press the Shift key and I change my brush into the smooth brush, see Z intensity changes. It's got its own Z intensity setting. So if I turn this down while I'm holding Shift, I now have a softer smooth brush. It's not as destructive. So when you're working at lower subdivision levels, it's valuable to turn down the Z intensity on that brush. There we are. Going to go back to my clay tubes brush. And let's build up these shapes here. Give a nice little sort of aggressive shape there. Go back to my move brush. You see that you can navigate those brush hotkeys really quickly. I want to have some horns coming out of these cheekbones later, so I'm going to create little sockets that we're going to put tusks in there in a second. So let's go ahead and change that. There we go. That's interesting. I want to change this angle here. We haven't sculpted a mouth or anything yet, but we're going to. Now let's say that we want to put a neck in here. So if I come around to the underside of the head, and I mask out where the neck will grow from, so to speak, invert that mask, and then let's say I take the move brush and then I just sort of drag those faces down, I'm going to start running out of faces here. You see how it all starts to stretch there? I'm going to switch into frame mode here by turning on the polyframe button, which is basically the Shift F hotkey, F as in frame. You see my geometry starts stretching. What happens here is you can divide again if you want to add a neck and shoulders, but what ends up happening is you run out of geometry. I couldn't stretch the sphere out into an entire body. So what I'm going to do is, instead of stretching this neck down and trying to subdivide more, we're going to change into a new type of sculpting mode. Alright, so I have 4 subdivision levels. Done a lot of sculpting and detailing here, or sculpting and sketching and getting different ideas. Now I'm ready to move into a new type of tool which will allow me to grow a neck and shoulders out of this model. So I'm going to go to Geometry, Dynamesh, and I'm going to turn on Dynamesh. Now what Dynamesh will do is it's going to get rid of these subdivision levels here. I won't have these anymore, but I will have a new tool that's very, very useful. So I'm going to press Dynamesh. It says the mesh has multiple subdivision levels. We'll just tell it no. Now what just happened here, you probably won't be able to see it, so I'll go into frame mode and I'll undo it and do it again. This is the mesh before Dynamesh. Okay? I press Dynamesh and it rebuilds it into this sort of shrink-wrapped layer of tiny little quads. Now what this means is I can now stretch this neck out. So if I were to mask out the underside of the head here, invert that, and then let's just move that neck down. So use the move brush to stretch that neck down. And you see that geometry is all getting really stretched out and dirty and ugly. I'm going to turn my Z intensity up on my smooth brush this time because I'm working with more geometry. Smooth that out. Smooth that out. If I go into frame mode, you see how it's all stretched out. Because we're in Dynamesh mode, we no longer have subdivision levels, but what we can do is, if you control, click, and drag on the background, that executes Dynamesh. It rebuilds your Dynamesh. So remember, if you've got a mask on your object, and you control, click, and drag, that clears your mask. If you don't have a mask, and you control, click, and drag again, that executes Dynamesh. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue working with this. I'm going to turn off frame mode, and I'm going to go to my clay tubes brush. I'm going to start building up the volumes here for the shoulders and neck. Build up these volumes, take the move brush, stretch this down. Go into frame mode, you can see how it's all stretching. If I control, click, and drag on the background, it Dynameshes. It rebuilds everything. So basically, Dynamesh allows you to sculpt without having to worry about the original volume of your sphere. You're no longer tied to whatever that original volume you were sculpting on was, which is really liberating. For years in ZBrush, you imported a mesh, and you were kind of stuck with the general volume of that mesh. If you brought a head in, you were sculpting a head. You might be able to stretch some shoulders out of it, but it was never going to be able to be stretched out into an entire body. This really allows pure sketching. You can continue to sketch and sculpt and add volume and just keep Dynameshing, and it'll keep building up as you go. So let's go ahead and build up these shoulders here. I'm going to go back to my move brush, turn my draw size up, and let's sort of stretch these shapes out and down. So I can just stretch as far as I need, and then I can always Dynamesh it again. There we go. Control, click, and drag on the background, and that executes the Dynamesh. You can control how dense your Dynamesh is. Like, this is probably a bit dense for what I'm trying to do. If I want to make this a little bit lighter, I can come over here to my resolution slider, and instead of making that 128, I can make that 88. And then control, click, and drag, and you'll see that it simplifies that mesh, just makes it a little bit lighter. And sometimes that's a bit easier to work with if you're still in a sketching mode and you're not trying to create anything really specific. So now we can continue working in our shapes here. I'm going to go back to my clay tubes brush, and I want to build up that muscle transition between the backside, the underside of the jaw here, and the trachea and the neck here. I want to build that up so it feels more natural here. Now, anytime you're sculpting, if you hold down the Alt key, it will subtract. So I can build up with my brush just normally like this, and then if I hold down the Alt key, I can subtract. So I'm actually subtracting now. I'm pushing back. Now I'm building up. You can see it change. Here, if I turn on Alt, or excuse me, if I turn on Add, that adds. If I turn on Z sub, that subtracts. But instead of actually using these buttons, I just leave it on Z add and then press the Alt key if I want to subtract. And that's true for all brushes. Behaves a little bit differently with the move brush, but every brush has an alternate form. There we go. Just thinking about the muscles of the neck here. And some clavicles. Just sketching in the anatomy here. Thinking about the pectoralis muscles here that are attached to the clavicles there. And I'll go back to my move brush. Oops. And let's change some of this gesture here. Going back to my clay tubes brush, I'm just going to continue sort of sculpting some muscle and bone form in here, just trying to make some more interesting shapes on the head. And I always try and do this sort of loose and gesturally. Our character can definitely use some ears, so at this stage what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask out where those ears would be. Put them about here. I'm going to invert that mask, and then I'm going to use the move brush to pull those ears out. I'm just going to pull them out from the head like this. I'm not going to try and get too specific with the ears yet. I just want to get the basic shape pulled out. Smooth it a bit so we get a nicer transition there. There we go. Smooth that a bit. Now I'm going to control click and drag once on the background, and that clears the mask. Now watch what happens when I do it again. If you watch the back of the ears here, I'm going to control click and drag again, and that executes Dynamesh and just rebuilds the mesh. Now I've actually set some hotkeys for my favorite brushes because I prefer not having to navigate like this when I want to grab brushes that I grab hundreds and hundreds of times a day. I'd rather just press one button, which will allow me to access that particular brush. So I'll show you in a moment how we actually hotkey our brushes. So I'm just getting the basic shape of the ears in here. I'm going to mask those ears out. And I'm going to use the move brush just to scooch the head back behind there, just so we get that nice sense of the back of the ear there, so it's not growing straight out of the side of the head. There we go, and execute Dynamesh. So I actually want to hotkey some of my favorite brushes. So I'm going to go to the brush menu here, and I'm going to press this little radial icon, and that tears it off and docks it on the side of the screen. Now this button here under the brush menu, that's my brush palette, the big one. And all these little brushes, these represent the brushes that I have most recently selected. So my favorite brushes to use on a daily basis are the move brush, which we've been using lots, the standard brush, which we started out with, which is just this basic standard sketching brush. I like the inflate brush, which is this brush here. The inflate brush does exactly what it sounds like. It inflates the form underneath it. It helps create bulges and folds. And the damn standard brush, which is this brush here, which is really nice for sculpting folds and wrinkles and creases. That's a brush that I'm going to start using a whole lot on this sculpture in just a minute. So what I like to do is I like to have these hotkeys. So if you watch my brush selection here, as I press the number 1, I've got move. Number 2 is standard. Number 3 is inflate. Number 4 is clay tubes. And number 5 is damn standard. Now the way that I do that is, if I come over here to the brush menu, these little brushes here, I'm going to hotkey these. So I press Control, Alt, and then click on the icon for, let's say, the move brush. At the top of my screen now, you see it says press any key combination to assign a custom hotkey. So I press the number 1, and that assigns the number 1 hotkey to the move brush. I'm going to do the same now for the standard brush. I'm going to press Control, Alt, click on standard, and set that to number 2. I will now do the inflate brush. Control Alt click on inflate and make that number 3. We'll make 4 clay tubes, and we'll make 5 the damn standard brush, which is right there, 5. Now if you want to hotkey a brush that's not in this list right here, then all you have to do is just come in here and select the brush. So let's say I want to make number 6, I don't know, let's make that the number 6 can be the clay brush. So if I click that, I now have the clay brush on this list. So I can Control Alt click on that and set that to number 6. And so on and so on. I find that in ZBrush, it's a lot like as a traditional sculptor, when I was sculpting clay for a living, I had about, $1,000 worth of sculpting tools that I had collected over the years, but only 5 that I really honestly used every day. The same is true for painters. They'll have so many brushes, but there's about 5 brushes that are the real go-to ones. And the same is true in ZBrush. You have this massive selection of brushes that goes so deep into the program, but there's going to be 5 real workhorse brushes that you constantly use. So we're going to go ahead and save these hotkeys. I'm going to go to Preferences, Hotkeys, and just click Store, and that saves that hotkey selection. So now every time I restart ZBrush, my hotkeys will come with it.